In this video, we will talk about curriculum development and implementation. This video is based on Chapter 13 from Lunenburg and Ornstein's Educational Administration Concepts and Practices, published in 2011 by Cengage Learning. We will start by discussing curriculum definitions and approaches. We will move on to talking about curriculum development. Then we will discuss components of curriculum development. We will touch upon what knowledge is of most worth, and finally we will conclude by the implementation of new curriculum as a change process. Okay, so there are many definitions of curriculum, and one of possible ways a curriculum could be defined is it could be seen as a plan, right? Another way to view curriculum is in terms of experiences that the students experience, right? Another possibility is to conceptualize curriculum as a field of study. Finally, we could also understand curriculum as a subject matter, and also in terms of grade levels, right? Specific for certain grades in school. Most curriculum leaders in schools, the practitioners, they are more comfortable with the three or out of these four definitions, right? So they are not very comfortable about this definition of curriculum as a field of study. This is more this is a definition with which theoreticians and like academics are more comfortable with, because these are the people who study curriculum as a field of study, right? In practical terms, really, curriculum is more of a plan, experiences that students go through, and the subject matter, grade level wise kind of perspective of curriculum. Okay. So there are four basic approaches to developing curriculum: behavioral, managerial, systems, and humanistic. Okay, most school administrators, according to Lunenburg and Ornstein, adhere to the first two approaches, behavioral and managerial. The systems approach is a bit more theoretical, so therefore kind of less straightforwardly applicable in real life, like in day-to-day lives of most schools, right? Of course, there might be school administrators who implement this approach, but in general, because it's somewhat overly theoretical, it's not that widely spread in practice. And the humanistic approach, kind of coincides with progressive thought, and it's not even an approach, more like you could probably see elements of the humanistic approach in the way people apply the behavioral, managerial, and even systems approaches to developing curriculum. Let's talk about each of those approaches a little bit. So the behavioral approach it's strongly associated with the University of Chicago School of Thought. It relies on technical and scientific principles, and it includes models, prescriptions, step-by-step strategies of formulating curriculum, and often curriculum is like based on some plan, often called a blueprint. This kind of curriculum, developed using a behavioral approach, specifies goals and objectives. Then after that, content and experiences are sequenced. They are developed to coincide with the objectives, and then the learning outcomes are evaluated against the goals and objectives. Okay, very systematic, very prescription kind of like in step-by-step development of curriculum. So it's been in use for more than 90 years, and you'll probably already noticed how it's rooted in Taylorism, with its focus on efficiency. There are obvious connections to the scientific management theories, right? And because of all of that, critics sometimes call this approach machine theory. Okay, don't confuse with machine learning. This is machine theory, kind of viewing overly focused on efficiency, right? There is a cult of efficiency, right? And often in history, at least in the United States, the applications of the behavioral approach to curriculum development. They overemphasized efficiency, and often smaller classes were eliminated. Student-teacher ratios increased. Fewer administrators were hired to cut down costs. Also, costs were cut by reducing salaries, of course, mostly of the teachers. So other things. So the outcome was here's an efficient, cost-effective school. Okay. So Ralph Tyler is one of the more recent big authors in this paradigm. He popularized this approach, and he popularized some ways in which behavioral approach could be implemented in schools, in developing curriculum in schools. His writing was very concise and clear, and maybe that's what made his views very popular. So, according to him, there are 4 questions to be answered if you want to design a curriculum using a behavioral approach. Okay, the first question is, what educational purposes should the school seek to attain? Remember, goals and objectives, right? Begin with them. Question 2, what educational experiences can be provided that are likely to attain these purposes, right? Remember, step 2, plan the content and experiences that lead to those goals and objectives, right? The third question, how can these educational experiences be effectively organized? Then you think about effectively organizing, right? Remember that cost effectiveness and all other things, right? Optimize, very rational, kind of technocratic approach. And finally, how can we determine whether these principles are being attained? Basically, remember that evaluate the learning outcomes, whatever outcomes you have, against your goals and objectives. The next approach is called managerial approach, right? And it considers a school as a social system in which groups of people, students, teachers, administration, interact according to certain norms and behaviors, right? So in this approach, administrators plan the curriculum in terms of programs, schedules, space, resources, and equipment, personnel, and departments, right? So if you think about it, it's more like there is more of a managerial component in implementing the curriculum. And it is still strongly connected to the behavioral approach. It just focuses other things. So this approach, the managerial approach, advocates the need for selecting, organizing, communicating with, and supervising people involved in curriculum decisions. Basically, again, a focus on the managerial aspect of developing and implementing curriculum. It is indeed an offshoot of the behavioral approach. It also relies on a plan similar to the behavioral approach. Yeah, it relies on rational principles, logical steps, but the focus shifts away from behavioral approaches, and for example, the managerial aspect, tends to be close to zero in the supervision and administration of curriculum, right? So really the focus on change and innovation is stronger here. And the focus is really on how curriculum specialists, supervisors, and administrators can facilitate these processes. Okay, this approach was dominant in the United States in the 1950s and the 60s. Right, there was less focus on teaching and learning in this approach, and more focus on organizing and implementing, curriculum development. Another approach to curriculum development is called systems approach, and as the name tells us, it focuses on organizing curriculum into a system. Okay. Also, another name of it is curriculum engineering. This approach is influenced by the systems theory, systems analysis, and systems engineering. Right. It views school consisting of parts. Right. And in this approach, parts of the total school or the total school district, they are closely examined in terms of their interrelatedness and influence on each other. Okay, so a manager, an administrator would plan not the goals and objectives and experience, but more like components of a school as a system, right? So curriculum is viewed more as something that underlies, is underscores everything in the school, right? So you plan components, things like departments, personnel, equipment, schedules, right? And you plan all of those to create change in people's behavior and expectations. Okay, this is really a macro view of the curriculum, which goes beyond, much further beyond that, in the view in viewing the curriculum than the previous two approaches we talked about. And finally, there is this humanistic approach to curriculum development, which criticized the earlier three approaches as too technocratic and rigid, right? And in this approach, the focus is on the social and personal aspects of the curriculum, right? It is rooted in progressive philosophy and child centered movement that appeared in the early 1900s. And thanks to this approach in curriculum development, we now have such familiar curriculum activities as lessons based on life experiences, group projects, field trips, social enterprises, right, and other things. Can you even imagine our teaching or our schools without this kind of activities? Well, now you know that this was developed about more than 100 years ago, but still not, quite recently, okay? And it was developed within the humanistic approach to curriculum development. Okay, our book, Lunenburg and Ornstein, they mention that the humanistic approach appears to be more suitable to middle class students, right? This is more socioeconomically advantaged kind of students, right? Because this kind of students tend to have high independence for learning, and they feel better off, they do better off in low structured situations. And the book argues that maybe lower SES, poorer students might not find this approach comfortable or productive because they might need more direction. And think for yourself about that. And this approach, according to our book, became popular again in the United States in the 1970s. Okay, I would say elements of this approach can be found pretty much everywhere nowadays to a greater or lesser extent. As we said, the classic and most common method of curriculum development is based on the Tyler model, which is behavioral in nature, right? And the non-technical models, the humanistic approach, right, relies on personal, philosophical, and reflective ideas, and most administrators would consider the model to be impractical, right? You would hardly, you wouldn't find a lot of schools, with curriculums designed entirely according to the non-technical model, the humanistic model. I think really we are talking more about elements of those things. Regardless of definition or approach, curriculum can be organized into three major components, right? First, content, the what of curriculum, and experiences and environment. Experiences and environment, they both refer to the how of the curriculum, okay? So, how do we select content for curriculum when we are developing it, irrespective of our approach, right? So, one of the, classic texts on curriculum development by Hilda Tabaa argues that there are 5 criteria for selecting content. The first is to include 4 levels of knowledge. Curriculum should have first, facts, skills, processes, basic, then second, basic ideas, including generalizations, principles, causal relationships. Third, concepts dealing with abstract ideas, complex systems. And finally, thought systems or methods of problem solving. The second criterion for selecting content, according to Hilda Tabaa, is new fundamentals to master, right? Because knowledge keeps appearing, and there is new knowledge all the time. Curriculum needs to be updated to include new content. The third criterion for selecting content is scope. We want the content to be very broad, deep, and have variety to it. The first criterion is sequence. So this is about how to order content in the curriculum, right? It is about the cumulative and continuous aspect of learning. Finally, the fifth criterion is integration, right? It is about the relationships among various content themes, topics, or units. We want our curriculum to be integrated and have, some logical relations among its parts. Next, in curriculum development, we could talk about some criteria for selecting learning experiences, right? And here, Lunenburg and Ornstein offer 5 criterion. First, learners must have experiences that give them opportunity to practice the behaviors implied by the objectives. Notice the behavioral approach here again, right? Goals and objectives. The second criterion is that students must obtain satisfaction in carrying out of or performing the learning experiences. So here we're talking about motivation, right? Students who are satisfied in doing the experiences, going through them, they are motivated and they are interested in learning further. The third criterion is that learning experiences must be appropriate to the student's present attainments. Fourth, several experiences can attain the same objective. And fifth, the same learning experience usually results in several outcomes. All of these things we can take into account when selecting learning experiences into our curriculum. And next, we want to talk about balance in determining curriculum, right? A balanced curriculum has appropriate emphasis on content and experiences to ensure a proper weight and broad range to each aspect of the curriculum. Basically, there are many approaches, designing a balanced curriculum, right? And there are 20 things that Lunenburg and Ornstein mention. That are very important to consider on a practical level, right? So let's just have a look at them. They are very self-explanatory. So I think it's amazing that just looking at that list of these 20 things kind of makes you it humbles you, right? Because it's not so easy to design a balanced curriculum. So next time when you feel like your course or your curriculum isn't too balanced, maybe you wanna don't feel so bad and use this checklist to check. Okay, so the first is needs of the society versus the needs of the learner. Okay, that there should be a balance there. Next, excellence versus equality, standard-based versus individualized learning, cognitive, affective, psychomotor, and moral domains of learning, behavioral versus non-behavioral objectives, technological computerized versus humanistic artistic focus, subject-centered versus student-centered curriculum, general versus specialized content, breadth versus depth in content, content versus process, essential knowledge versus abstract methods, traditional versus progressive ideas, national versus global, academic, business, vocational, and technical tracks, gifted, talented, average, and slow learners, advanced placement required in elective subjects, whole language versus phonetics. Well, I didn't get this one really. I guess this means whole language versus emphasizing certain aspects of learning language like phonetics, grammar, and other things. Classroom lab activities versus community or field-based activities, homogeneous versus heterogeneous grouping, whole group, small group, and individualized instruction. Okay, so now that you know how to balance your curriculum, let's talk about what knowledge is of most worth. Which of the knowledge which is out there we should include? Which of that is most valuable, right? It's a very difficult question, and Lunenburg and Ornstein discuss a couple of things we want to consider. Not couple, really, several things we want to consider when deciding what knowledge is of most value and whether we should include that or not into our curriculum, right? So first, in talking about knowledge of facts, Lunenburg and Ornstein remind us that in Bloom's taxonomy, knowledge is the lowest form of cognitive learning, right? It really serves as a foundation for more advanced thinking. So think about whether do you want your curriculum to be overly focusing on facts and learning facts, okay? Another thing we should consider is explosion of knowledge. Knowledge, and this book, published in 2011, was written before, the computers and the internet exploded all over the world, right? Not only in the industrialized countries. So we now face explosion of knowledge. Knowledge becomes obsolete very quickly, and we have to consider that in our curriculum development. We have to come up with some way to address this explosion of knowledge. Okay. Next, there is essential knowledge in several disciplines which we need irrespective of whatever is happening in the world, just to they serve as a foundation, for learning further, right? We should understand that and consider, we have to make sure that our students have that essential knowledge in our curriculum. And the book discusses the return to the liberal arts. This is a liberal arts education, once very popular in the US, I guess regaining popularity now, because we understand that in this ever-changing world, the liberal arts education offers us, really valuable skills, which can be easily transferable when some of the knowledge we have becomes obsolete even. Okay. Then the book discusses the importance of learning modern languages, talking about how people in the US and I think in many other industrialized countries don't really learn foreign languages. Next, we want to consider making sure that our students get computer knowledge and technology. The book also talks about the moral knowledge and that it should and could be taught through, reading classic texts, philosophical texts, and finally concludes with talking about moral character, reminding us that a person with moral knowledge, and following even some rules and laws, well, doesn't necessarily have a moral character, right? And Lunenburg and Ornstein encourage teachers, school administrators to not to be afraid to take up a moral standing and vocally communicate that and share it and share it with the students. Let's conclude our video lecture with talking about implementation as a change process. Okay, according to Lunenburg and Ornstein, curriculum implementation is largely a function of leadership style, and it involves personal interaction, program development, and organizational structures, right? And successful change, an implementation of a new curriculum, for example, or change of an existing one, involves collaboration, collegiality, and communication, what the authors call the 3 C's. Okay, and in implementing curriculum, administration needs to consider the principles of change and how they can influence change among staff members. Ideally, curriculum leaders must understand how professional people can plan, implement, and evaluate change, and realize that people often resist change and they also often accept change, okay? And an effective administrator can work with and convince the staff to be more receptive than resistance to change. A number of leadership characteristics are listed in this chapter 13, in Lunenburg and Ornstein, that could improve receptivity to change among your employees.